Welcome everyone to this new episode of The Next Page, our podcast here at Library and Archives, UN Geneva. Today, we're going to explore how virtual reality and artificial intelligence intersect with diplomacy and how these emerging technologies may have a role in reshaping the practice of multilateralism and peace building and peacekeeping. So for this conversation, we invited here Martin Wählisch, who has experienced directly, he has written about it, he teaches about it, and he has experience in some interesting experiments that he will describe to us. So Martin, welcome to the podcast. And let's kick off by you maybe introducing yourself to our audience and tell us about yourself and your work.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be part of this conversation. I've been working for the United Nations for over a decade now, looking at a range of issues. I actually started in the Middle East working for the UN in Lebanon, which is a topic of global concern at the moment. And then I moved to leading the innovation team in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, where we look at how do we borrow from unusual methods, including computational approaches, to advance diplomacy and multilateralism. And I'm currently taking a leave of absence and joined the University of Birmingham in an interesting, exciting initiative that looks at how we bring in AI into government. How do we use new technologies to advance the work of governments at large?
That's super interesting. So we're very happy to have you here for the next 45 minutes and start the exploration of these hot topics for everyone interested, either in technology or in multilateralism or both. So let's begin. Can you please introduce the technologies we're exploring today and in the context of diplomacy for peace and security so that we have an initial idea of, what do we mean by VR and AI in this particular context?
No, thanks for giving me a chance to also share a bit about kind of what has been happening in this field now for a long time. And I know a lot of attention is with regard to what AI can do for health or what AI can do for education. I feel kind of this area of foreign affairs and diplomacy is still, not paid enough attention to in this era of AI, of everything that we are living in. And let me start by, looking a bit backwards in history to say that technologies have advanced diplomacy for a long time. Not necessarily always digital technologies, but like think about a table or a chair, like configuration that help us advance conversations and build consensus. And especially the UN has paid attention to this for a long time. I think digital tech came in for the first time when the General Assembly was broadcasted in various languages across, the world, which was a way to make the work of multilateralism more inclusive. And the UN has invested a lot into telecommunication to, make sure that our peacekeepers are safe, that we can deliver humanitarian aid in places, have eyes and ears on the ground, but also in the sky to make sure we can respond to humanitarian disasters. And in the last years, especially, I think, kind of supercharged by the opportunities posed through the pandemic, the world has gone more digital. That's not just for diplomacy, but also for a field like diplomacy, where in the past there was a strong belief that in-person interaction is the gold standard or the platinum standard, so to say, and there was some kind of reluctance to have online conversation. And that has, at least through the pandemic, has created some opportunities where not just the United Nations, but also member states have turned to digital approaches to engage with each other.
Yeah, let's dig a little bit more. I assume there is a field for VR and a field for AI. So which part of VR and AI are you going to discuss with us today? Because there are so many applications.
Right. So what I'm especially interested in is how can we use new technologies at large, and that includes, extended realities, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, to do three things. Number one, prevent conflicts. And for that, we need multilateral action. Second, address conflict, manage them, transform them, and then also make sure there's no relapse, right? What we traditionally call as peace building, although here concepts are in flux. And let me give you three examples for each of how technologies play out. And indeed, there's a combination of one technology advancing the other. So it's very hard to say, what element of this is machine learning, what element of this is immersive storytelling. But let me give you an example for each of them: conflict prevention, peacemaking. and peace building. On the prevention side, a lot of the work that we have been doing in the Secretariat, but also elsewhere with partners, is on predictive analytics. How do we use large data to make sense of the world, to see ahead? That can be 6 months, 2 years, 10 years. And here machine learning, aka artificial intelligence, has been helpful in finding patterns that for the human eye wouldn't be obvious, or where you would need a very long PhD to make sense of, conflict behaviors in a certain place, where machine learning has helped us to find those patterns, point out things that we haven't paid attention to. That's kind of number one. And here a very concrete project that we have been working on, at least in the Secretariat, has been spinning around how do we use satellite images to make sense of weather changes, and then from that kind of distill conclusions with regard to climate security, right? Where we overlay data with regard to migration movements vis-a-vis climate impact, for instance. And that's open source, so open source kind of geospatial data, environmental data to advance conflict prevention, early warning system. That's one example. On the conflict management side, again, those categories are obviously fluid, so I'm just using kind of a little bit of a cluster here. Work around artificial intelligence has come to the forefront, where we've used artificial intelligence to advance public dialogues. We call them kind of AI-powered digital dialogues, basically where we have an artificial intelligence that allows a peace mediator, a peace negotiator, to talk to thousands of people at the same time. So you get the scale of a poll, but the intimacy of a focus group, where the conversation feels like you are talking alone to this peace envoy, something we have done in Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, Bolivia, many places, and an area that hopefully is increasingly becoming mainstream. And then on the peace building side, and that's a difficult field because this is not just multilateralism or something where we need diplomacy, but it's really about how do we overcome trauma of people? How can we relate to each other, right? And that's where we've used virtual reality, extended reality, as an opportunity to advance perspective taking. We can walk the journey of the other side, to understand the other side. And here a very concrete example has been the Pathways Colombia experience produced by our colleagues with our support in Colombia on the peace process that allows you to slip into the shoes of a former FARC member. How does their life look like? Slip into the shoes of a victim. What are they concerned with? And that's not just relevant for decision makers far away in New York, but also, or in Geneva, but like for the general population, right? To get the different perspectives. So 3 concrete examples using VR, artificial intelligence, machine learning to advance, conflict prevention, management, and peace building at large. And hence, advance multilateralism, because those require collective decisions, collective solidarity in that context.
Well, you said in the self-intro that you have worked for the UN 10 years. So could you tell us a little bit more about how did you get into this field of technology and peace, or technology for peace yourself?
Yeah, so I got recruited while working for a university in Lebanon quite some time ago, and I worked as a lawyer and looked at aspects with regard to maritime issues concerning Lebanon and Israel, but also the northern dimension. And my first job with the UN, actually before that, was as a consultant for BCPR, for UNDP, supporting the national dialogue in Lebanon. And then I got a chance to work more on the high-level diplomatic end in the office of the Special Coordinator for Lebanon, UNSCOL, at a time where the Syrian refugee crisis was having, a heavy toll for the country. So a lot of the work we did was around making sure that the Lebanese authorities are supported in kind of addressing that crisis, mobilizing international support. And data played a big role in that regard, because the first thing that falls in a dispute is the truth, right? The first thing that people doubt is the data. How many refugees do we actually have? What kind of funding do we actually receive, right? So that took a big part of my work, and I got interested in that area. Again, being schooled and kind of trained as a lawyer and as a conflict resolution expert. And I have to say that computer science has been never foreign for me. I grew up with computers all my life. This has some family roots. My brother, shout out to him here as a professor for computer science. And for me, new technologies were always a tool to make sense of the world, engage with the world. And I grew kind of in this direction, and was lucky enough that the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, under the leadership of Rosemary Carlo, made space to have a dedicated team to use new technologies for diplomatic activities of the United Nations.
Okay, that's super interesting. So that's also sort of a segue for where I would like to take the conversation. The second waypoint of our conversation would be talking about how these technologies and others have the power, or maybe not, to reshape diplomacy going forward. So you mentioned how technology has always been there. Then you mentioned a few examples, including chairs, etc. But when we look from close at how the area of professionalism, of diplomacy, have been directly impacted by technology so far, and we compare it with the medical sector, or say engineering, or even education.
Right.
There is a disparity. The diplomacy has resisted quite a bit, either consciously or unconsciously, but the degree of technological penetration in the actual tradecraft is very unbalanced if you put engineering and diplomacy, or medicine and diplomacy together. So I would like to ask you, maybe as an expert, what is the actual potential of technology today becoming really part of what we call the diplomatic practice, daily and in an organizational fashion as well?
Well, I think the potential is enormous and underutilized still because of the attitudes you just described, right? There's still some odd comfort in celebrating the paper and the pen. And if you look at the table of Security Council members, you have kind of the same setting that you had like nearly 80 years from now. And I think there's good reason for celebrating kind of non-digital approaches because, you know, they don't always work, right? They're not superior yet. And we shouldn't glorify technologies for the sake of technology. I think that's very important. So that means that when we look at kind of diplomatic studies and international relations studies, there's some glorification of the good old traditions, so to say, and that's worth for what it's worth, but at the same time, we can't shy away from using every tool we have at hand to advance multilateralism and advance international consensus. And one of those tools are new technologies like artificial intelligence, like virtual reality. And that requires us to, think beyond the technology that diplomats are already using. So let me give you a few examples here. Number one, if you do a survey among diplomats in New York of who has not used ChatGPT to draft a press release or a resolution for the Security Council or the General Assembly, the numbers would be low. Most people use it intuitively or not intuitively, right? Intuitively would be just using it because, it is included in your Word Microsoft application or on your phone, for instance, for spell check and other reasons. And that's going to be the future, by the way, where nobody asks whether or not you're using it because you're using it intuitively. It's just part of your kind of attire, so to say. But then I'm more interested in like looking at technology in a dedicated way, doing investments into technologies that don't exist yet. And I spoke about data, which is a field where the technology only helps us to find patterns if we have good data at hand. And let me flag an initiative of member states, including the Secretary General here, which is a Conflict Risk Fund, CRAFT, where member states came together, thankfully, to make funding available to create more common data sets, right, on climate change, for instance, on gender and so forth, because the machines can only help us make sense of the world if we give them parameters to make sense of. And that requires still some good old-fashioned kind of data collection, data cleaning, which is very hideous. And I know the library does a lot of work on that to secure knowledge, right? Because how can we make sense of the world if the foundations are not proper? So that's, I think, something I'm interested in. And then the second part, and I think there we could be a bit more forward-leaning, and the United Nations, again, like I've only been with the UN for over 10 years. Others have been with the UN for like 20, 30, 40 years, has come a long way. Just in my career, again, in the past, when we talked about AI, would say artificial intelligence very quietly because everybody would ridicule us. Now, thanks to the current Secretary General, there's some kind of enthusiasm and some forward thinking to think about technologies we haven't built yet. And we look for kind of those opportunities to shape multilateral negotiations and diplomacy with tools that we still need to build.
Are you aware of examples where the use of technology in these new technologies, let's say the use of new technologies in diplomacy went wrong?
That's a tough one, because if I wanted to spin this around, I would say it's not the technology that does the error, but the human or the individual that kind of navigates the technology. And think about the many Zoom calls or team calls, virtual calls you have where the microphone is not on or the camera is not working or the connection breaks, right? And who's to blame there? The machine or the person who is operating that? But indeed, a few thoughts maybe off the cuff. One is, I spoke earlier about digital dialogues. Really a true benefit of listening to people that are usually not invited to the peace negotiation, and that's assisted by AI that summarizes quickly what those thousands of people say. Where I think one of the challenges is to overcome mistrust vis-a-vis the technology. And there were moments, and there's public knowledge of that because it was reported in Libya, where some participants kind of hijacked the conversation. We're bringing this to a point where it gave the impression that the topic of discussion should be topic X, Y, Z. Again, those who are listening in can look this up and can do the Google search of that. And there was some doubt about the usefulness of the technology. Right? Is it the right tool? Is it too easy to be hijacked? Is it too easy to be manipulated? What about, are the servers run by the UN or a public company? So there was some doubt about potential flaws, which we openly addressed, making transparent, and I think transparency is an important element, what the limitations are, what technology we use, right? So not to black box those issues in, but address them openly, because from every situation we learn. In that case, we learned that we need a separate protected server that has capacity available. We were also concerned that the kind of server capacity wouldn't manage the inflow of participants, right? So we learned from that and moved on. I think that's one concrete example. A second one, if you allow me, is really around VR, where I hear a lot of critique with regard to, the fact that virtual reality still requires you to have a headset, right? It only works for the first world. Isn't the UN just promoting a technology that is worth for the first world? Who can afford an Apple Pro VR device? And we went, through a very careful process looking at technology that is available to the extent possible globally and for a price that is affordable. Yes, it's still a luxury item, as a phone was in the past, as an iPhone was in the past, or an Android phone. But if we kind of not avail ourselves of the opportunity to use it, we miss out on the opportunities here. And here again, openly addressing it, saying that virtual reality plays a role in certain cases. It creates attention for issues where we need attention for, especially forgotten peace processes. One lessons learned was here again, openly address those intrinsic flaws and kind of concerns and move on. Because the alternative is just to stay conservative and do everything that you used to do. And I'm so happy that the UN is forward-looking and we have leadership that says, no, we need to use new technologies to advance our work.
Yeah, and let's focus on the UN for a second and start looking at how there have been experiments. I wasn't on UN TV, for example. I saw diplomats using VR in the context of an experiment. Maybe you can say a few words about that. And also, what was their response? The response of member states. The UN is an organization created by member states for member states. So when we look at the specific reality of the UN, you mentioned a few technology that may apply to diplomacy in general, peace in general. But what is the response that you had by member states, and in particular in the experiments that you were part of in New York, in your UN work?
Well, thanks so much, Francesco, first of all, for making advertisement for a documentary we produced. So for the audience out there, if you type in United Nations Virtual Reality Experiment, you end up either on YouTube or on your web TV, and you see a documentary where we talk to the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, but also members of the Security Council at the time in 2021 in December, that tried out virtual reality for the first time, right? And not to tell you too much about this documentary, because I want you to watch the whole kind of 10 minutes plus, but we basically put on diplomats a virtual reality headset and have them watch Pathways Colombia, which was and is a production of our colleagues in the verification mission of Colombia on the peace process. And we wanted to see what the responses are, also to make sure we go in the right way and kind of, disarm the critics. Because I feel haters going to hate, lovers going to love. There are always individuals that are more forward-leaning, and there are those who are more skeptical. Now, watch the documentary, but a little bit of a kind of teaser here, Amos Bush, so to say here. I was surprised that some of the diplomats have been consuming VR for a long time, and they talk about this, so it's nothing you surprise them with. It's rather that they're spoiled, to a certain extent. I say this in a very kind and humble way, to expect that the UN would do something like that. So that's number one. That I found interesting. And then number two, those who were first-time consumers and users watch the documentary yourself, were astonished, and appreciated this, not to replace in-person interaction, not to replace kind of human-to-human contact, but to advance and add an additional tool to the toolbox, right? That's something I want to underline. I want to underline that this is not about replacing in-person interaction, but rather supplementing, advancing in-person interaction so that you get a briefing before you go on a trip, for instance. Now, I think we've seen an uptake of technologies globally, not just in the United Nations, but also in regional organizations. And if you look at kind of the series of resolutions in the General Assembly and in the Security Council, member states have kind of articulated that they are paying attention to technologies in all contexts, not just peace and security, also development, humanitarian context, and so forth. So the UN is pretty much responding to what the member states are asking for. And if you look at the Global Digital Compact and the Summit of the Future, technology plays a big role in the reality we're living and will play an even greater role in the future.
Yeah, and staying with the future, could you tell us this experiment that is narrated in the documentary, described in the, I watched the documentary and I thought, okay, if we're doing these things now in 2023, 24, what would be then the future of this? So do you have a vision of this kind of integration of technology in the work of the UN as an organization in the next, 5, 10 years, maybe 10 years, 10 years and onward?
So let me put on my scientific hat here, as an academic researcher and just look at what others have said when it comes to introducing new technologies. And here, historical background, like the introduction of the calculator, for instance, in schools in the 70s that led to outrage and demonstrations where both teachers associations and also parent associations were demonstrating against the calculator. It would kind of, make us weaker and math would disappear. So there's a lot to learn, I think, from academic research on how technologies get introduced in societies, right? And here, Roy Amaro comes to mind, who was a futurist at Stanford and made a few assumptions. One issue he promulgated was the following, that we overestimate the impact of new technologies in the short run, and we underestimate the impact of new technologies in the long run. What does that mean? That means in the beginning, there's a big hype around new technologies. That fades away, but the technology is not going to go away. So if you ask me about a vision, I have probably various visions, and I also have wishes in that regard, probably. Number one is that technologies are very powerful when you don't feel them anymore, right? And you use the word integrate, and I think I want to add intuitive to it, right? When technologies are integrated in existing devices, think about the Internet of Things, where your phone has artificial intelligence, where your computer learns everything about you, a bit of a frightening scenario as well to a certain extent. So that's why visions, right? Because oscillate between kind of optimism, but also skepticism at the same time, in the very same scenario. I think we need to hold truth to various futures at the same time. So that's, I think, one vision where it becomes integrated and intuitive, where you don't feel it anymore. You can talk to the machine to build applications for you, right? And then I hope also, and that's a second universe of realities, where we are using technologies in a very responsible way, where we have seen big flaws, and for that we need to test new technologies. And currently technologies in that context, in the peace and security context, are tested out in the issue, in the context of warfare. And I wonder how well that is going with regard to identifying targets. And there will be a lot of lessons to be learned from that as well. And at the same time, we learn from it for reconstruction efforts, right? Like predicting where reconstruction effort needs to take place. Or think about the various natural disasters that we are currently facing, where colleagues from OCHA and UNDP are looking at satellite images and how we can learn about the potential impact of a certain natural disaster in a certain region. And I hope, and that's a wish, that we explore those potentials to the fullest, not just to adapt, to use technology that we see for our own use or be mindful that it's present, but to build, right? And I think for that, and it's spelled out in many UN documents, including digital roadmaps of the Secretary General, we need partnerships. We need partnerships to academia, and we need partnerships into different multilateral organizations, and we need partnerships also with industries that are working on technological solutions that are helpful to advance the agenda of the United Nations.
Is technology advancing at a pace that will make it virtually impossible to catch up with in terms of governance and good governance. So there is a lot of talk about, digital governance, the governance of the internet, etc. And we saw also the digital compact being approved by member states in the context of the Summit of the Future. But he also said something that I would like to explore more, the fact that there is a whole lot of technology in warfare, and there is less technology maybe in peace building today. So if those two continue to travel at current speed, then it will be impossible for the second to ever catch up with the first. Is that a future that we should be contemplating, or there is something here that I'm missing?
No, unfortunately, this has been the reality, right? If you compare the money spent for the destruction of humanity to the funding we have at hand for conflict prevention or peace building, there's a big disparity. And I think the UN exists to kind of counterbalance that. And there's an interesting artifact in the UN Secretariat in New York, which is a clock of military spending in comparison to spending for multilateral efforts. And you can imagine what kind of gigantic disparity we're facing in that regard. And I don't think this is going to go away in the future, because apparently, as I'm not a sociologist or anthropologist, but apparently our brain ticks in that way, that we find some odd fascination in killing each other and destroying each other, unfortunately, despite all the lessons learned of the First and Second World War, right? Or many other wars that came after and that will come for us. Which brings me to another thing that we haven't talked about yet, which is behavioral science. I think one important aspect, and you see this spelled out in the UN 2.0 agenda of the United Nations, which includes, let me just point out those 5 things: innovation, data, strategic forces, so dealing with the future, and then obviously also behavioral science is about thinking, how can we learn from new discoveries on the brain and cognitive side to make sure that those technologies are really helpful and create an impact and make people move, so that they're not just gadgets, right? And this kind of impact analysis is happening on the warfare side. We need to do the same on the peace building side to be very strong when we come into the game and say, hey, we need more funding to advance kind of those projects. But coming back to your earlier point, I think I wish, and I'm a pacifist by heart. I think probably everybody or most of us who work in the United Nations, apart from right to self-defense and so forth, fully understood, we say, look, we need to invest more into peace. But unfortunately, it's still something we need to convince the world for.
Martin, as we wrap up our conversation, I wanted to ask you if you could direct our audience to places on the web, in particular, where they can learn more about technology and multilateralism, technology and peace, and in particular AI and VR. We're going to put in the notes to this podcast all the links to the documentary you mentioned, but other things, including your articles. But there must be places that you may want to just point our audience to, those who want to learn more about this topic.
Well, thanks for that. And full disclaimer, I'm a big fan of the UN Library. I've spent a lot of time in the library in New York when I did my PhD, and I'll point the audience to the library. There are fantastic online resources if you don't have the opportunity to come to New York or Geneva. I think the library is the first entry point. It provides a lot of helpful resources, number one. Number two, there's the United Nations Innovation Network, UNIN, which if you Google that, you find instantly resources from the broader UN innovation community on how technologies are used to advance multilateral issues, including peace and security, development, humanitarian, human rights, and so forth. That's a second link I would suggest to look into. A third one, that's a bit of self-advertising for DPPA, but I hope that's allowed, is futuringpeace.org, which is basically a repository for the different projects that the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs has worked on. And then if you allow me again, some advertisement, which would be for the University of Birmingham, the Center for AI in Government, which just started, but has helpful resources on how AI is used in government at large. And kind of those 4 pointers are our starting point. There is also a very helpful LinkedIn channel on UN 2.0, where you see what's happening on the UN 2.0 agenda in the United Nations that I suggest to follow. And here a shout out to students that might be listening in. The United Nations really welcomes computer scientists, data scientists into the UN family. So if that made you excited, please join. There are many opportunities that are posted on those channels that I mentioned.
Fantastic. This is really helpful. And so here we are concluding this podcast with you, Martin. I wonder if there is one final thought that you would wish to leave with our audience.
That's a tough one. I think one final thought is to never give up trying and experiment, especially with new technologies at a time where this is surrounding us in every field. Become a child again, but not childish, and keep thinking about the opportunities. We should keep thinking about the opportunities to advance peace and security at a time where it's needed more than ever before.
Well, that sounds fantastic to me. So, Martin Wählisch, thank you so much for being with us on the next page for this episode. We hope to see you again.
Thank you.